High above the jungles of the Solomon Islands, a single American fighter pilot realized something was terribly wrong. 5 Japanese Zero fighters were closing in around him. His engine temperature was climbing toward the red line. His ammunition counter was already lower than he liked. And back at the airstrip, most of the men in his squadron had quietly assumed that if he ever met the enemy alone, he probably wouldn't come back. They called him the library pilot, not because he was weak, but because he was different. While other pilots relaxed between missions or argued about tactics over poker games, he spent his time reading intelligence reports and studying aircraft manuals. To many of them, that seemed like the wrong way to prepare for war. But on that day in 1943, surrounded by enemy fighters over Bougainville, his strange habits were about to change everything. The Pacific Air War had become a brutal contest of endurance. By late 1943, the Solomon Islands campaign had turned into a daily struggle for control of the sky. American forces were pushing north through a chain of islands that stretched toward Japan itself. Each island captured meant new airfields, new bombers, and another step closer to the Japanese homeland. But every step forward came at a price. Japanese air units defending the region were experienced and determined. Many of their pilots had already fought for years across China and the Pacific. And their aircraft, the famous Mitsubishi A6M0, still carried a fearsome reputation. The Zero had dominated the early months of the war. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and outmaneuver almost anything the Americans had flown in 1942. Pilots who underestimated it rarely survived long enough to learn their mistake. American doctrine had adapted. Pilots were taught a simple rule: never turn with a Zero. Instead, they relied on speed. Dive attacks. Quick strikes followed by fast escapes. But real combat was rarely that simple. Dogfights unfolded in chaos. Pilots lost sight of wingmen. Targets appeared and vanished in seconds. And too often, American fighters were dragged into turning battles where the Zero held every advantage. New aircraft had begun to shift the balance. The F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were powerful machines, larger, faster, and far more durable than the fragile Zero. They carried heavy armament and strong engines capable of pushing them through steep dives that Japanese fighters could not safely follow. But even the best aircraft could not save a pilot who used it incorrectly. And that was the problem. Many American aviators still fought the Zero the way they had been trained before the new aircraft arrived. They treated dogfights like contests of reflex and courage. Few treated them like problems that could be studied and solved. Kenneth Walsh believed something different. Walsh had been born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1916. His family struggled through the difficult years of the Great Depression, moving often as his father searched for steady work. Kenneth was not the kind of young man people expected to become a fighter ace. He was quiet, observant, and unusually patient. While other boys spent their afternoons playing sports in crowded city streets, Walsh spent his time reading about airplanes. Books about aviation fascinated him. Aircraft engines, flight mechanics, navigation. Everything about flying captured his imagination. When Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in 1927, Walsh made a decision. One day, somehow he would fly. But dreams required opportunity. And flying lessons cost money. Money the Walsh family simply didn't have. So at 17 years old, Walsh chose another path. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. His plan was simple: serve his time, learn everything he could, and eventually find a way into the cockpit. For years he worked as an enlisted Marine, watching aircraft from the ground. He studied them carefully, noticing small details most people ignored. The way engines responded to throttle changes, the way wings flexed under load, the way experienced pilots handled difficult landings. Walsh applied repeatedly to the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. Each time he was rejected. Competition was intense. Many candidates had college degrees or previous flying experience. Walsh had neither, but he refused to give up. He studied relentlessly for the entrance exams. Navigation formulas, weather systems, aerodynamics. Every detail mattered. Finally, in 1936, his persistence paid off. He was accepted for flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola. Something unexpected happened there. The quiet Marine who had spent years studying airplanes turned out to be an exceptional pilot. His instructors noticed his smooth control of the aircraft and his calm reactions under pressure. But what impressed them most was his mindset. Walsh approached flying differently from most cadets. To him, flying was not just a physical skill. It was an intellectual challenge. A complex system that could be understood, analyzed, mastered. Even after earning his wings as a Marine aviator, Walsh continued studying. He collected translated manuals describing Japanese aircraft. He read intelligence summaries from battles in China and the Pacific. He examined combat reports written by American pilots who had already fought the Zero. He filled notebooks with diagrams and calculations, trying to understand the enemy aircraft as precisely as possible. His fellow pilots noticed. Some admired the effort. Others found it strange. Combat flying, they believed, wasn't about studying. It was about courage, speed, aggression. The nickname library pilot began as a joke. Walsh never argued. He simply kept reading. By mid-1943, the American air campaign in the Solomons was under enormous pressure. Japanese fighters continued to challenge every bombing mission, and experienced Japanese pilots were still extremely dangerous opponents. Walsh believed the problem wasn't just the enemy. It was how American pilots thought about the fight. They were reacting, improvising, surviving, but they were not fully using the information already available to them. In intelligence reports, engineers had documented something important about the Zero. Its incredible maneuverability came with serious weaknesses. The aircraft lacked armor protection. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, and its structure was extremely light. At high speeds, its control surfaces stiffened. In steep dives, it became difficult to control. Walsh studied these details carefully. To most pilots, they were just technical notes. To Walsh, they were weapons waiting to be used. He began developing a system, a way of fighting that relied on energy, altitude, and physics rather than pure instinct. He calculated the speeds where American fighters held advantages. He mapped out attack angles that forced the Zero into situations it could not escape. And he practiced these maneuvers over and over in his mind, waiting for the day he could test them in real combat. That day arrived in August 1943. Walsh's squadron was assigned to escort SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacking Japanese positions near Bougainville. The weather looked deceptively calm. Scattered clouds drifted across a bright sky. The ocean below shimmered in tropical sunlight. It seemed like just another mission. But within minutes, everything would change. The mission began quietly. Walsh walked across the rough coral airstrip toward his F-4U Corsair, the powerful fighter already warming up under the tropical sun. Ground crews moved between aircraft checking ammunition belts and fuel lines while the deep rumble of radial engines echoed across the jungle clearing. He climbed into the cockpit slowly, performing every step of the pre-flight checklist from memory. Gunsight alignment, fuel mixture, oil pressure, oxygen supply. Every instrument had to be perfect. The ground crew had long since learned not to rush him. Walsh prepared for combat the way a surgeon prepared for an operation, carefully, methodically, with absolute focus. Around him, other Corsairs began taxiing into position. The engines roared louder as the squadron prepared to launch. Within minutes, the fighters lifted into the humid Solomon Islands sky and began climbing toward escort altitude. Below them, a formation of SBD Dauntless dive bombers droned steadily toward their target near the Japanese airfield at Kahili, on the southern tip of Bougainville. The plan was simple. The bombers would strike the airfield. The fighters would keep Japanese interceptors away long enough for the attack to succeed. But war rarely followed simple plans. Walsh scanned the sky constantly. Left, right, above, below. His head moved almost mechanically as he searched for the slightest sign of danger. The Japanese preferred surprise. They attacked from altitude, diving down on bomber formations from behind where pilots had the least visibility. Walsh knew it was only a matter of time. The attack came suddenly. Bogies high. The radio crackled with warning calls. Dots appeared above the formation. Then those dots became aircraft. 5 Mitsubishi Zero fighters diving fast from the sun. The sky exploded into motion. Pilots shouted over the radio. "Brake right. Zero's behind us." Corsairs rolled into defensive turns as Japanese fighters slashed through the formation with blazing machine guns. Tracer fire stitched the sky with glowing lines. The orderly bomber escort formation dissolved into a swirling chaos of climbing and diving aircraft. Walsh reacted instantly, but not the way most pilots would have. Instead of turning toward the attackers, he dived. The Corsair dropped sharply. Wind roared across the canopy as the aircraft accelerated. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly. 2 Zeros immediately followed him down, their pilots confident they had isolated an American fighter from the rest of the formation. From their perspective, the situation looked perfect. 2 against 1. An easy kill. But Walsh had already begun counting in his head. Seconds. Speed. Energy. All the numbers he had studied in his notebooks suddenly mattered. The Corsair passed 300 knots. At those speeds, the Zero began to struggle. Its control surfaces stiffened under the pressure of fast-moving air. The Japanese pilots found it increasingly difficult to track the Corsair's movements. Walsh waited exactly as long as he dared. Then he pulled back on the stick. The Corsair surged upward, converting speed into altitude. The pursuing Zeros tried to follow, but their aircraft lost energy during the climb. For the first time in the fight, Walsh held the advantage. At the top of the climb, he rolled the aircraft inverted and dropped back down toward the trailing Zero. The Japanese pilot never saw it coming. Walsh lined up the gun sight. His thumb pressed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns roared together. The burst lasted less than a second. It was enough. The Zero shattered under the impact, pieces of wing tearing away as the aircraft spiraled downward toward the jungle. Walsh had just turned a defensive dive into his first victory. But the battle was far from finished. More Japanese fighters were converging on the bomber formation. Walsh's fuel gauge had already dropped dangerously low, and his engine temperature was climbing toward the red line. A cautious pilot would have disengaged immediately, returned to base. Walsh did not, because the bombers below still needed protection, and because he believed the fight was not yet finished. Within minutes, Walsh found himself completely alone. His squadron had scattered during the dogfight. Between him and the bombers were 4 remaining Zero fighters, 4 experienced enemy pilots, 1 American aircraft, his ammunition partially spent, his engine overheating. And yet Walsh felt strangely calm. The chaos around him faded. His mind focused on one thing: geometry, angles, energy, possibilities. The battle had become a puzzle, and puzzles could be solved. Walsh climbed again. Altitude meant advantage. The Zeros below were still focused on attacking the bombers. For a few precious seconds they ignored him. That was exactly what Walsh had hoped for. He positioned himself carefully, the sun behind his aircraft, the enemy below. Then he pushed the Corsair into another steep dive. The wind screamed across the aircraft as he accelerated. The dive felt almost vertical. Walsh held the gun sight steady as the first Zero filled the center of the sight. The range closed rapidly. 250 yards. 200 yards. 150 yards. He fired. The stream of .50 caliber bullets tore through the Japanese fighter. The aircraft disintegrated instantly, spinning downward in flames. 2 Zeros down. 3 remaining. And the fight was just beginning. The destruction of the second Zero lasted only seconds. But in aerial combat, seconds were everything. Walsh streaked past the exploding fighter at tremendous speed, the Corsair vibrating as it pulled out of the dive. Below him, the jungle of Bougainville flashed briefly through the clouds before disappearing again beneath the aircraft's wings. 3 Zeros remained, and now they knew exactly where he was. The Japanese pilots reacted quickly. Instead of chasing the bombers, the remaining fighters began climbing toward the lone American aircraft that had just destroyed 2 of their comrades. Walsh watched them carefully. Their movements were coordinated. These were not inexperienced pilots. They climbed together, spreading slightly apart to approach from different angles, an attempt to trap him in a crossfire. Walsh had read about this tactic in intelligence reports. 2 fighters attacking together could force a target into a position where escape became almost impossible. But knowing the tactic meant he also understood its weakness. The maneuver depended on forcing the enemy into a turning fight. Walsh refused to turn. He pushed the Corsair downward again. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, plunging toward the cloud layer below. The Zeros followed. At first. But once again Walsh allowed the speed to build far beyond what the Japanese aircraft could comfortably handle. The Corsair felt solid beneath him, the powerful engine roaring as the aircraft sliced through the humid air. Behind him, the pursuing fighters struggled. The Zero had never been designed for prolonged high-speed dives. Its light structure and delicate control surfaces made such maneuvers dangerous. Walsh counted the seconds again. He knew the moment was coming. Then he pulled up sharply. The Corsair surged upward like a thrown spear. The sudden transition from dive to climb forced enormous strain on the airframe, but the American fighter was built for punishment. Behind him, one of the Zeros attempted to follow. The pilot pulled too hard, too fast. The Japanese aircraft lost energy almost immediately. Walsh rolled and dropped down behind him. For a moment, the Zero filled the gun sight perfectly. Walsh fired. Another burst of .50 caliber rounds hammered the fragile fighter. Smoke erupted from the engine. The aircraft rolled violently and began spiraling toward the jungle below. 3 Zeros destroyed. 2 remaining. Walsh's ammunition counter was dropping rapidly now. Less than a quarter of his rounds remained. His engine temperature needle hovered dangerously close to the red zone. The Corsair had already taken hits during the earlier head-on exchange. The smart decision would have been obvious. Break contact. Return to base. Survival alone would have been victory. But Walsh looked down. The American bombers were still there, still flying toward their target. And the 2 remaining Zeros were beginning to move toward them again. Walsh made his decision. He climbed once more, burning precious fuel for altitude. The 2 Japanese fighters turned upward to meet him. They approached carefully now, no longer overconfident. They knew they were facing a dangerous opponent. The 2 aircraft separated slightly, attempting to attack from opposite sides. Walsh recognized the trap. If he turned toward one enemy, the other would gain a firing angle. He needed to break their coordination, and he knew exactly how to do it. Walsh dove directly toward the lower Zero. A head-on attack. One of the most dangerous maneuvers in aerial combat. The closure rate was terrifying. Both aircraft fired simultaneously. Tracers streaked through the sky between them. Walsh saw flashes as bullets struck the Corsair's engine cowling. The aircraft shuddered under the impacts. But Walsh's concentrated fire found its target. The Zero's cockpit area erupted in sparks and smoke. The fighter dropped away, trailing flames as it spiraled downward. 4 Zeros destroyed. 1 remained. Now the sky suddenly felt quiet. The final Japanese pilot did not rush into attack. He circled cautiously, studying Walsh's damaged aircraft. Walsh could tell immediately that this opponent was experienced. Probably an ace. The 2 aircraft moved in wide circles above the jungle. Watching. Waiting. Walsh's situation was deteriorating quickly. His engine was running rough. Oil temperature climbing. Ammunition nearly gone. He could not survive a prolonged engagement. The Japanese pilot likely assumed the same thing, which gave Walsh his final opportunity. He deliberately made a mistake. At least, that was how it appeared. Walsh began climbing steeply, exposing the underside of the Corsair to the enemy fighter. The belly of an aircraft was always its most vulnerable point. The Zero pilot immediately took the bait. He dove to attack, exactly as Walsh had predicted. At the last possible moment, Walsh reversed his turn. The Corsair stalled briefly as it snapped around. The Zero flashed across his gun sight. Walsh squeezed the trigger. His final burst of ammunition tore into the Japanese aircraft. The Zero's engine coughed black smoke. The fighter rolled over and began a slow spiral toward the jungle far below. 5 Zeros. 1 American pilot. The sky over Bougainville suddenly belonged to Walsh. But the fight had taken its toll. His Corsair was riddled with bullet holes. The engine vibrated violently with every rotation. Fuel gauges showed almost nothing remaining. Walsh turned the aircraft toward Munda Airfield, nursing the damaged engine as gently as he could. Each mile felt longer than the last. But eventually the familiar strip of crushed coral appeared ahead. Walsh lowered the landing gear. The Corsair touched down hard and rolled to a stop. When the ground crew surrounded the aircraft, they counted more than a dozen bullet impacts in the fuselage and engine cowling. The engine itself would need complete replacement. Walsh climbed out of the cockpit quietly. The library pilot had just proven that knowledge could be as deadly as instinct. Word of the engagement spread quickly across the marine aviation units in the Solomon Islands. Dogfights were chaotic by nature, and victory claims were always treated with caution. Pilots often believed they had destroyed enemy aircraft that later managed to limp back to base. Every report was examined carefully, but this time there were witnesses. The bomber crews Walsh had protected described the battle in detail. Several of them had watched the Corsair repeatedly dive out of the clouds to strike Japanese fighters that had been moments away from attacking their formation. Gun camera footage confirmed parts of the story. It was grainy, incomplete, and filled with the violent motion typical of aerial combat. But the evidence was clear enough. The quiet pilot with the notebook had just destroyed 5 enemy fighters in a single engagement. What surprised intelligence officers even more than the outcome was the way Walsh described the fight. During his debriefing, he did not talk about courage or luck. He talked about angles, about energy states, about the exact speeds where the Zero became difficult to control. He referenced intelligence reports he had studied months earlier and explained how specific details about Japanese aircraft performance had shaped his decisions in combat. Then he began drawing diagrams. On a chalkboard, he reconstructed the dogfight step by step, showing how each maneuver had forced the Japanese fighters into positions where their aircraft were weakest. The officers listening to him realized they were hearing something new. This was not simply a pilot describing instinctive reactions. This was a man who had engineered the fight before it happened. The sky had merely been the place where the theory was tested. Within weeks, Walsh's approach began influencing other squadrons. His tactical notes circulated among Marine and Navy fighter units throughout the Pacific. Pilots who had once teased him for studying technical manuals now asked for copies of his notebook. Intelligence officers who wrote reports about enemy aircraft suddenly found their work being requested by frontline pilots. Something important was changing. Pilots were beginning to understand that knowledge itself could be a weapon. The results appeared in the numbers. Squadrons that adopted Walsh's energy-based tactics reported improved kill-to-loss ratios. Pilots trained to exploit the Zero's structural limitations survived engagements that might previously have ended in disaster. The old belief that dogfighting depended mostly on instinct slowly gave way to a different idea. Combat could be studied, prepared for, optimized. The sky would always be unpredictable, but it no longer had to be mysterious. Walsh continued flying combat missions through the remainder of 1943 and into 1944. His reputation grew steadily as he added victory after victory to his record. By the time his combat tour ended, Kenneth Walsh had achieved 21 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the highest-scoring Marine Corps aces of the Pacific War. On February 4, 1944, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his courage, his extraordinary skill, and his determination to protect the bomber formations entrusted to him. But the pilots who truly understood what Walsh had accomplished recognized something even more important. He had proven that preparation could rival instinct. That knowledge applied correctly could be as deadly as machine guns mounted in the wings. The influence of that idea extended far beyond a single battle. In the years after the war, the United States military began formalizing the analytical approach to aerial combat that Walsh had practiced almost instinctively. Fighter pilots were trained to study enemy aircraft capabilities, to analyze combat reports, to develop precise countertactics based on physics, engineering, and intelligence. Eventually, those ideas would become institutionalized in programs like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, later known around the world as Top Gun. The philosophy behind that school was simple. Understand your enemy, understand your aircraft, and treat combat as a discipline that could be studied, not merely survived. In many ways, that philosophy began in cockpits like Walsh's. After the war, Kenneth Walsh remained in the United States Marine Corps. He served for many years before retiring in 1962 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Like many veterans of his generation, he rarely spoke about his combat experiences. He did not seek attention. He did not try to build a reputation around the medal he had earned. Those who met him later in life often described him the same way. Quiet, thoughtful, almost embarrassed by praise. If anyone asked about his Medal of Honor, Walsh usually redirected the conversation toward something else. The design of aircraft, the mechanics of flight, the science behind aerial tactics. Even decades later, he remained more interested in the ideas behind combat than the glory that sometimes followed it. Kenneth Ambrose Walsh passed away on July 30, 1998, at the age of 82. He was buried with full military honors. His Medal of Honor was displayed at his service. The library pilot had closed his books for the last time, but the lesson he left behind remained open. Today, the jungle peaks of Bougainville are quiet. The airstrips where corsairs once roared into the sky have long since been reclaimed by vegetation. The aircraft that fought there survive mostly in museums. Their engines silent. Their battles finished. Yet the principle Walsh demonstrated continues to shape the world far beyond aviation. In classrooms, in laboratories, in military academies, in businesses and industries where success depends on preparation, people still follow the same pattern Walsh once followed. They study their competition. They analyze strengths and weaknesses. They prepare while others rely only on instinct. And when the moment of pressure arrives, they discover the same truth Kenneth Walsh proved in the skies over the Solomon Islands. The most powerful weapon a fighter pilot ever carried was never mounted on the wings. It was carried in the mind willing to think when everyone else believed thinking was over.